in 3, 2, 1. We're going to be winning this debate by showing that governments are just significantly worse at allocating capital to sustainable growth than private markets. Before that, one piece of important framing. This debate is about the whole world. That includes Turkey, it includes Brazil, it includes Venezuela, it even includes the US or the UK under Donald Trump or the UK under Liz Truss. It includes all of the worst governments who take out shitty loans that cause hyperinflation and end up destroying the economy of countries all over the world, as we well know. We're talking about countries that have spent decades trying to recover from these awful government interventions. I don't think we know of any such thing where they let the private market do its job, even if they didn't get, yeah, that's it, yeah, okay, cool. So, I'm going to have a bunch of mechanisms for why we think that the government is worse at allocating capital and then impacts within each one. So, why do we think in general that the government has significantly worse incentives than the private markets? Number one, I think that a lot of this is around political accountability. Within the government, there is a significant amount of accountability to specific niche industries. Think about Donald Trump and mining, or Donald Trump and coal, and or steel and stuff like this. These are things that are not economically useful and do not cause economic growth, because these jobs would be better allocated in other countries, and it would be better if even the US just built green infrastructure within those countries. It's just that the miners don't want to relearn how to manufacture other things, and so we see that they end up that the politicians are held to account to do policies that are actively harmful to sustaining the growth. But secondly, there are also many times lobbies by big companies or by things like that actively cause the government to pass laws or pass regulations or create subsidies that make it more difficult for other companies to compete, or that perpetuate the slowing of growth by preventing access to free markets. Thirdly, I think that oftentimes the government just wants to do vanity projects. A good example, although you guys won't know it, is the Israeli train to Eilat, which Bibi is pushing very strongly, even though nobody's actually going to ride it. But it doesn't matter. It's like massive statues. It's the trains that Biden built because he wanted to show that he'd done something and that nobody actually goes on. But fourthly, it's also short-termist. Oftentimes, the government wants to show immediate growth in jobs, not sustainable growth in jobs, which is what opening opposition are going to have to prove. And that's why the Biden infrastructure bill put a huge amount of money into building trains all over the country, even though nobody is riding those trains and nobody is using those trains. So the jobs, they didn't create any long-term jobs or create a sustainable growth within that country. On the comparative, we think that markets have an immediate accountability to people who care about a very tangible benefit. They care about getting money, and if you do not show that you're going to be able to pay back the loan, pay back what you have spent the money on, then you will be fired. And so that means that you have a direct and immediate accountability. Secondly, it's also much more measurable. You're measured by the economic output of what you have done. And thirdly, there's far more oversight. There's oversight at the level of the board, of the shareholders, of the workers, and of all these different things, which creates a much less alignment of incentives that is more focused on specific economic growth. So this is both a specificity claim, where what interests these companies is being more efficient and being more effective, and thus growing more sustainably, and it's also about their ability to them being held to account to do so. Secondly, we think the government has significantly less knowledge. The reasons for this are threefold. One, price is knowledge, right? When you know how people price things, then you know how much they are worth, and whether investing in that will create a sustainable market. This is something that the markets do have because they are selling goods, whereas the government oftentimes isn't trying to make money. When it puts a price on my bus ticket, it doesn't care if it loses money because that's not the purpose of what it's trying to do, which means it's not allocating the money efficiently, or at least it doesn't know that it's allocating the money efficiently. Secondly, it's often hard for the government to pin down it's often very hard for the government to pin down why they were voted in and what policies were actually going to cause significant growth. So for example, Donald Trump doesn't know if the reason that people voted for him is because he created growth in this sector or that sector or the other sector, which means it's much harder for him to go for that. But thirdly, I also think they just have significantly less market research and long-term ability to lead those kinds of changes than companies that oftentimes can keep the CEO or keep the overall plan. Whereas within the political sphere, when people when 1 year it's a Republican and the next year it's a Democrat, or even 4 years it's a Republican and 4 years it's a Democrat, that means it's not stable and not as certain. So it means you don't have as much knowledge of what is going to happen in the future, and you don't know that the person after you is going to fulfill the economic policy that you began. On the comparative, I think the markets have, as I said, a clear pricing metric so that they know what they're doing. They can pin down the user interest and what will cause and lead to sustained growth. They know how to price it and they know what it will be worth in the future. And fourthly, they invest a lot more in actually researching these things. Finally, thirdly, I want to say that the government has significantly worse manpower. It has a lower and capped salary, which means that just people who are the best people often don't want to work for them in comparison to the markets who can pay a lot more. But secondly, they also have a lot less market experience and they're much less up to date. People who work for the government don't know the ins and outs of the markets in the same way that somebody who literally works day to day with these companies and lives their needs, unlike people on the comparative. And thirdly, I think they often just have less incentives to do good. They themselves are not going to see a massive income from the shares that they have. They're not going to see a bonus from succeeding. They're not going to get really very much. And so this leads to a classic agent problem where they just don't invest as much time and effort in actually doing the job and in actually succeeding on the average. I don't know if anybody here works in that thing. I'm sure you guys are great. But on average, most of these people are often lazy and boring and terrible. And we know this whenever we have to interact with our governments, especially if you're from Brazil or from anywhere else in the world, which is not the most advanced countries. On the comparative, obviously, this is not true. Yeah?
Given that stability allows for these private companies to succeed, why do they not cooperate with governments?
I think that oftentimes the government gives money to the worst kinds of companies in the worst kinds of ways that makes it more difficult for people to compete afterwards and creates less sustainable growth, as I already said. Finally, I also think the government is much slower. Notice this is very important because it means that we end up not actually getting the responses to crises that we need in order to prevent them and to get to sustained growth. One, because there's just a huge amount of transparency we need to do for the government. There's a lot of red tape. We also need to prevent corruption and stuff like that at the levels of the government, which then means that oftentimes our reactions are much slower. We need to coordinate between the parliament and the government, which means that there are two completely separate bodies with separate interests and oftentimes the interests that collide. Look at the US, for example, which makes it much harder to actually pass policy. And finally, there's often just time that it only happens once a year. On the comparative, obviously, you can cut through red tape. There's one person who makes decisions at different levels. Finally, notice one thing here. What I've shown so far also just shows that the government will often just take very bad loans, especially the part about vanity projects. This is awful because at the end of the day, debt is a significant impediment to be able to create long-term growth. Because when I invest a huge amount and then I need to spend 5% of my GDP on paying back my debt, that's money I can't spend on economic growth. And so there's a huge prior for them having to show that for some reason, the things I choose to invest in will create this economic growth. Whew. Thank you so much.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. I want to do a bunch of framing on what changes and what stays the same in this debate because I suspect there's going to be a lot of mess and I want to be very clear on what we think is the real difference. Few crucial points. Firstly, on circulation of money in the economy. I want to observe there are precisely 3 ways in which you can increase government spending. 1, you can increase taxes in order to fund this spending. If this is the method, circulation of money in the economy does not change because the counterfactual to taking taxes and spending them is the money staying in people's pockets, which they would either spend or invest, which would still lead to growth. And this is exactly where Yishai's analysis comes into play and why we prefer the market to allocate the money as opposed to the government. Second method, you can print more money. This is just taxation with extra steps. Inflation is a flat tax. If you print more money, the direct effect of this is everyone's money in their pockets is now worth less in comparison. So again, circulation of money does not really change in this instance either. The third option, which is the most common one, is taking debt. This is literally the only way in which government can increase circulation of money in the economy in the short run on their side that would not be symmetric. Why is this important? Because this will show you, panel, why the metric to judge this debate on is purely the question of who allocates this money better. Because when circulation is symmetric, then we want the better actor to allocate it. And when it is not symmetric, here's what happens. Debt needs to be repaid later with interest. If the government made a good investment, sure, they can pay it back. But if the government made a bad investment, like digging holes just to fill them back in with the sole purpose of creating jobs, obviously they will not get growth in return, they will not be able to pay it back, and this is when they create a short-term increase of influx of money in the economy for a long-term, much bigger decrease of influx of money in the economy. So this is why this debate should be judged on the question of do governments choose well or badly in comparison to the market. Second point of framing I want to make. Read the info slide. This motion is about government policies that are aimed at sustainable economic growth. Why is this important? Other government policies where the main motivation is not economic growth don't change. What does that look like? For example, in times of economic crisis that are not purely a crisis because of monetary policy, but say something like there is an objective shortage in the market and we need to spend much more to fix it because otherwise people would starve, this isn't an economic policy. You need to buy the lacking food. Similarly, if there is currently a war going on leading to the economic crisis, it is not that Hayek would say, oh, just die and don't pay for your military expenses. On both sides, you would need to increase expenses in this situation. Similar thing with COVID, similar thing with most of these crises. Similarly, when you have policy that is aimed at helping specifically the people who would otherwise not get their basic needs, like things like medicine, this is again not an economic policy. I will concede they get more redistribution on their side for sure, because when they tax more and then the government spends it, it is more progressive than how the tax does it. But redistribution is very different than serving the basic needs of the most vulnerable people, and not something that they can assert is a good thing in debate where you're not judging on the metric of what is more left-wing. There are plenty of reasons to believe that redistribution can be bad. It creates bad incentives to work because you get a lot of free money and you pay more when you work more. It can create a lot of principal harm to people who have earned money that they deserve. I just don't think they can assert redistribution is a good thing. That being said, why do we think governments do their jobs badly? Let's directly engage Aidan on this. Aidan gives us one primary mechanism for why governments operate well, and this is they are accountable to voters. I think Yishai already preempted this. Here are a few crucial reasons why. One, half of the world is not democratic at all, and they need to defend this as well. Secondly, even within democracies, not always people vote purely on the economy. See, for example, in countries like Israel, surely you vote on security first. Thirdly, even in countries when you do vote on the economy, you do it once every 4, 5, 6 years, not on every immediate policy. And even then, we think the public is stupid and doesn't understand what is good economic policy. So without explaining why the public understands macroeconomics, they cannot just assert this is good accountability just because you get voted on it. Lastly, because as Yishai showed you, this is a short-term incentive. This is a bad accountability mechanism because this is exactly what made Biden do things such as build railways that till today, panel, are empty and have no trains going over them because he had the incentive to create jobs in the short run and doesn't care if in a candidate after him there would still be a functioning train. So we don't think accountability from voters is good. Why do we win then on governments? Firstly, I think governments frequently have bad incentives. This is due to lobbyism, this is due to corruption, this is also due to just simple things such as a sunk cost fallacy, such as if a market made a bad investment and it failed, then you know what it will do? It will pull out its investment and the company will collapse. And it's fine because it's just one company. But if the government made a bad investment, it would not want to admit its mistake, it will want to save face, and it will continue funding it for years even when it's bad closing.
So what do companies do in times of economic crisis when consumers stop spending?
Again, in times of economic crisis, I think that the delta is small, but you know what? Let's engage this directly. I think there are simultaneously less crises on our side as well as better ability to handle them on our side. Firstly, why are there less economic crises on our side? For a very simple reason. When you spend a lot of money in the day-to-day, and a lot of it reaches, as we prove, bad investments, eventually you get a debt that you are not able to pay back. This is when what started as an inflation ends up as a recession. Factories shut down because they were not good. People lose jobs. This is the boom and bust cycle. This is also meaning that when you create artificial inflation that does not reflect the real market growth in good times, you create also speculative investments based on it that are likelier to create bubbles that end up bursting, and again, likelier to create crises. Lastly, crashes of unsustainable projects are also often having waves of effect. But we think that even when crisis happens, we handle it better. Why? Because on our side, when you really need to, you have the money to spend. On their side, you have already accumulated debt when you didn't have to in times of good. You did not save for the times when you need it, and you left the safety net. And on our side, you have a low inflation rate to begin with. On their side, you have a high inflation rate to begin with, making a hyperinflation when you need to fix a crisis when it happens. Propose.
We thank the speaker for that speech. We now invite the deputy leader of the opposition to conclude the top half. Sorry? Yeah.
Ready? If I had to use two words to describe the open government case, they would be false dichotomy. And I think that this is true in two ways in this debate. Firstly, they're basically lying when they say that it's either the government or the companies operating. That is, the problem with our frame in this debate is that in the cases in which they're discussing, as in when the market is healthy, when you have actors operating, you will still get most of the good investment they want on their side. Crucially then, they fail to meet the burden of explaining how it is that the government spending they are bashing on prevents the corporations from doing many of these good types of acts that they want. That is, at best, they can show that taxes make it slightly higher, but they would note that for any individual actor, the taxes aren't going to be that big in terms of how much money they lose. That is, the majority of the benefits still accrue in this debate. Secondly, though, they're just skirting the clash on circulation, which is that when they say that spending is going to be the same, this is just false. That is, Hadar gives three things here. Firstly, she says that the money would be invested otherwise when it's in your pocket. And I think that this is where it's good to discuss how actors will behave when a crisis happens, basically. And there are a few things to say here. Firstly, on the ordinary consumers. And note that this is super important because they're a baseline of what runs the economy. That is, for corporations to remain afloat, for them to continue making profit and reinvesting it, they need to have something to sell. You don't sell your houses to Aquaman, you sell them to people. If people aren't spending money anymore, corporations will sink. What happens then? A, the average Joe who spends doesn't know how other market actors will operate and will tend to assume the worst given how bad it is if the economy goes badly. This looks like saving your money at home or putting it in the bank rather than investing it. Secondly, though, it's the case that when the crises do come, you often get a sort of signaling spiral. That is, as soon as you see other people doing this, as soon as you see the first corporation go down, you become really worried because it's basically a prisoner's dilemma. That is, if you hold your money out, but everybody else pulls it before you, you will be fucked and they will be fine. Therefore, because you don't trust the other actors, it is the case that you're incentivized to pull this money out to keep it for yourself. Note the crucial implication this has on the debate. A, when governments raise taxes, especially in times of crisis, this is money that wouldn't be getting invested in the way they say, especially because investment returns are going to be horrible during those times. B, when the government prints money, as in when they do policies like quantitative easing, again, this is money that would be sitting in a bank that is being inflated, and I think that this is fine. No, thank you. Thirdly, though, I just think that it's false that debt is somehow bad. The thing to note is that debt is the unique way, as Aidan explains, to pursue many projects that you don't have a reason to do otherwise. Things like roads, things like hospitals. The government response here is very flippant, and they say, private actors are going to do the same thing. The thing to note, though, is that often the people who are benefited from the existence of a road often aren't the same ones who are incentivized to pay for said road. That is, the same way you're going to have many, for example, people commuting during the day, or you're going to have many trucks going from one city to another. These are not actors who would always be incentivized to pay for this, but rather the government is able to aggregate these funds and do something that is good for everyone within this debate. The thing to note then is that circulation isn't symmetric. In times of crisis, corporations are failing. They aren't able to do all the good things opening government wants, and the government is a single actor with the information, with the capacity to fix all of the issues that we described to you in our case. Next up, on the issue of policy, and HUJI tried this thing here where they're yeah, like these economic theories are about promoting sustainable growth. Note why this shouldn't be the way to judge the debate. Yes, it is true that the theory is aimed at promoting growth, but this doesn't necessarily mean that this is the moral burden that ought to be defended in this debate. And the issue in here is as follows. Yes, it is the case that corporations will primarily follow growth-based models. But the issue is who should have control of the money? Should the government get more of a say, or should it be the corporations who get to make those decisions? And we give you two very clear answers here. Firstly, corporations are massively self-interested at the expense of all the other actors and cause big harms to them. Secondly, though, corporations often don't give a shit about other things that matter. Things like the environment, things like labor rights. And yes, HUJI here can say that you're able to perhaps pursue the same things anyway, but note what you need to run regulatory agencies. You need money. You need government intervention in how the economy runs, and often these are going to be the very unfortunate side effects of the policies that opening government has to defend. At this point, then, let's basically engage in the last thing left in opening government, which is the accountability clash. What HUJI say here is this idea that like politicians are going to be vain or they're going to be pursuing very bad projects. Firstly, I would basically say that this is false. Insofar, I think that your risk aversion is far like higher in your priorities than your vanity. The reason for this is simple. Most politicians aren't close to retiring. Most senators and members are going to be in the House for a good 10, 15, or 20 years. And you know you're going to be held to account. Secondly, though, the existence of organizations like political parties are the reason that you have like continuity of accountability on politicians. The issue on their side is that even if the CEOs are the same, no one fucking knows who the CEO of these corporations are. Yes, some investors will, but the public doesn't. And the public has no way to punish these corporations efficiently, especially when they do things like run monopolies on their side of the house. Next up, they say lobbying. Note, however, how this is symmetric on both sides of the house, but even beyond that, the issue is that the same lobbying money they're complaining about is the money that on their side is going to be used to harm other individuals in the market, basically. As in, I think this is power that's being used badly. The question is this something we should merely be permitting, or should it be the case that we're intervening on the behalf of these individuals? Next up, we're told that distribution is bad and that individuals are going to be like lazy and not work. This is taken out by Aidan's framing, explaining why you only use these policies when it is absolutely necessary. The signaling effect is here. That is, the fact that we're now essentially... Oh, thank you. Closing, please. Lucie. Hadar, sure.
If you save money in the bank will invest it for you, no difference. In times of crisis, which are not the entirety of this debate, you lack a comparative. We prove governments make it worse.
The bank only invests the money when it's profitable for the bank to do so. When things are risky because people aren't spending, this mechanism doesn't work. Beyond this though, money often just gets held back to the extent that when the economy is being deflationary, when you think it's going to be worth more tomorrow, this is when holding it is better than spending it, because that means you're able to get a higher rate of return. On the impact then, we prove to you how we help the actors who need it the most. And note why this is the most important thing in this debate. Firstly, this is prior to them getting what they want in this debate. That is, the market only operates well, actors only decide well when their basic needs are met. It's the case that when you don't have the information, when you're scared, you make worse decisions for yourself. Second piece of weighing though is that property rights are not absolute. Yes, there's a degree to which you're entitled to your money, but this is qualified. We hold corporations to a higher degree of scrutiny. For example, we don't afford them rights like privacy, and we're far more willing to basically override this compared to individuals. But the third piece of weighing is that property rights only become meaningful when you can enjoy the use of the property. When you have people starving, when you have lack of access to things like roads and hospitals, I don't think that you're able to enjoy the property you have, and I think that this is a far worse principled violation than anything government can say in this debate. For all these reasons, I'm very proud to vote.
We thank the speaker for that speech. We now invite the member of government to open the closing half debate.
All good? We're going to give you two pretty simple extensions if people here want to
listen. The first here is that why we get more sustained growth that is actually able to happen, and secondly, why we reduce the intensity and frequency of crisis, showing that opening opposition creates the problem that they seek to solve. Let's start with why we get more sustained growth. Because opening government stops at pointing out why you struggle to judge the right decision. But they actually do this really weird thing where they don't say why you would actually make the wrong one, even if you struggle to judge the right one. There seems to be a question that is unanswered here, so we're going to show you what are the active harms that happen as a result of this, and not just some potential risks that are much more speculative. Firstly, it is a discouragement of competition and foreign direct investment. Why is that? Firstly, state capture. Keynesian economics means that you're having much more of the state involved within the economy. That is, you have much more in terms of these projects being started up, in terms of industries that are being facilitated by state money, being ones that have control of the state. That means that private actors are then much more scared to get involved. Meaning the state's going to prioritize regulations towards state companies or state-favored companies. And so there's a much greater fear of you not being able to succeed in the first place. But secondly, it is subsidization. It is the fact that you pick and choose winners. You think that some industries are better off, the trains, for instance, that opening government wants to talk about so much, and you give them advantages, things like lower taxes, even in the best case scenario for opposition bench, and then that means that those other industries struggle more and will struggle to succeed. Why does this crowd out competition and foreign direct investment? Firstly, it means you have less money pouring in because from other countries, investors think that they're not going to be able to make the return on the fixed costs that they face because the government will be able to just outcompete them. Even if it's a successful sector, the government will realize it's a successful sector and use that money to succeed in that way. On our side of the house, where we minimize government intervention, we create the conditions that give you confidence to say, look at this promising sector, look at mining, look at trains, and we can get in and we can make a profit, giving the incentive for people to come and invest in your country. But secondly, it is the fact that we have less new companies starting up on their side of the house because there's a greater risk associated with it. There's state co-optation. There's the fact that a different sector could be subsidized and therefore leaving your investments moot because now that other one is going to grow much faster. People will spend on that more. Why start a bus company when the government decides to outcompete you with trains the next day? So that means that there's less companies starting up to be able to do it. Why is this bad? Why is this bad? It means we get less competition. Competition would be likely to reduce prices because different companies want the same consumers and need to differentiate by trying to cut prices, by trying to innovate to reduce costs of production. And so what happens is on their side of the house, goods are more expensive because of state capture. Second thing, welfare as an alternative is something that I think would just be better off. Why is welfare better than stimulus as an approach? Firstly, there's a liquidity problem. Many nations might not be able to put lots of money in, but it does help to address the fact that you just can't buy bread, for instance, and so it means that you just give people money to do that. But secondly, this is a market prioritized approach. People spend on the best bread company, the winning firm, and then those people will keep their jobs, and then that means that they're able to survive into the future. So this isn't one that props up unsustainable businesses, but keeps them alive. What does this mean? It means that we're able to have far more successful economies, one that succeed more because we've actually now explained to you the ways that the private market creates success, something that was drastically lacking from opening government. Secondly then, the likelihood of crisis is far greater under a Keynesian approach. I want to weigh this for you first. The biggest impediment to sustained growth is crisis, because it hits you so hard. There's other sectors that can happen under a free market condition, for example, but the issue is that when you hit a crisis hard on an economy, that reduces confidence. That means investment lags up. That means that people lack the money to continually spend. Because sustained growth can't happen when you need to continually put plasters and patch jobs to try and fix the problems that are endemic within your economy. So that is the biggest impediment. If we solve this, we're clearly the ones who prove sustained growth. But also, I want to be a little frank here. We are going to talk about debt burdens. We're going to talk about that independently and in a far more important context. The frame here is pretty simple. Crises are kind of out of your control, right? Things like COVID, a supply shock like a famine, or an oil price increasing because you lose a supplier, are all things that you cannot control. So your ability to be resilient to those things is far more important. Let's start firstly. The reason why you're bad is because of your debt burden. Why is this problematic for you? Firstly, you're downgraded on capital markets because when you have lots of debt, even if you are paying it back over time, you fear giving out more debt because eventually it'll be too much. So investors will go to your country. You're scared that the people who are pouring money in will continually do it, and so you're scary to investors, so money dries up from your country. Secondly, when governments borrow heavily, they can drive up interest rates, make it more expensive for private businesses and individuals to borrow and invest, which stifles economic growth and innovation because they don't have the money to do so. They become dominators over the market. Thirdly, there's an increased plausibility of a shock, meaning that you can't make the payment because you need to pay triple for fuel. There's a liquidity issue where you just don't have enough dollars, which is what ends up happening in places like Argentina. That plausibility of a shock means that that hit is far harder. But lastly, you don't know where the debt will be transferred because eventually you have to pay it back. So there's an instability due to a fear of where and when you're going to try and collect that debt off of it. Hadar's only analysis here was that you have too much debt and it's hard to pay it back. But why does that increase the likelihood of crisis? OG identifies that you have a debt burden, but only impacted to governments losing money. And I don't know why it's an issue other than empty train. This is logically independent and encourages a far more important impact. Secondly, there's speculation on your currency. On their side of the house, bond buying and selling allows you to manipulate your currency. How does that work? Bonds are a fixed supply of your currency available on global markets. Buying up bonds to make your currency more expensive would work because there's lower supply of your currency. You sell it to make it cheaper because there's higher supply. You try to do this to encourage your exports. Why is this a problem? There's a fear your currency is over or undervalued. You're not sure if it's artificial or not, and there can be signs with things like capital controls, where China doesn't let dollars flow abroad, and so there's a fear that your currency is overvalued. What does this look like? It looks like A, people shorting your currency, fearing that it's going to crash, so they sell it off and want to make money off of that. That reduces confidence significantly and encourages other people to sell off. But secondly, it's self-reinforcing when you try and pick it up. When you try and intervene, that shows people that there's a problem, that means that they sell even more. That's what's happening with Japan on capital markets right now, where people fear they're going to fail, and that creates the failure in the first place. Before I talk about bubbles, Aidan, please.
Only when consumers and investors are safeguarded can you access your impacts of competition and development. Government subsidies are necessary to avoid panic and minimize overwhelming startup costs.
Yeah, no, but you've created the problem, right? Because you poured that money in that scared them off in the first place. You try to protect them, but do a pretty bad job of it. Thirdly, let's talk about bubbles. On their side, there's far more, with better reasons than OG. One, because you need to make a company succeed using Keynesianism. You need to borrow money to create those subsidies for a desirable outcome. That means, A, that company is not incentivized to be effective because they can depend on the subsidy. They can lobby for it to extend for longer. But secondly, it means that any competitor would be gutted when they begin in the first place. But second way that this will happen is through things like bailouts. When a company fails, you try to bail them out just so that people keep their jobs. What does that mean? That means that unsuccessful companies are being propped up by government money who probably should have failed, and now means when the crash happens, it's going to hit far harder. More people lose their jobs. More infrastructure goes under, and it's much more damaging. On our side of the house, they probably would still fail. But the failure happens when you're a smaller company. Other companies learn from the failures. You don't take up ridiculous amounts of debt to get market share, and instead try to prioritize a sustainable, profitable strategy. Which means, on our side of the house, businesses don't turn into bubbles in a way that scares off confidence from the economy. Why does this all matter? A, the intensity of the crisis is far lower. It means that it doesn't drag on for as long, and it doesn't hit as many people. Yes, some sectors will die and some people will be unemployed, but many more of them are the winners who are going to succeed continuously on our side of the house. That is clearly the most important thing in the round.
We thank the speaker for that speech. We now invite the member of the opposition to open the closing opposition case.
Already? Great. We found it interesting that opening government start by framing they were talking about the Hades and Venezuelas of the world, but then the case from top half largely occurs in states which are able to spend themselves out of crises. What we contend is that often loans are just a necessary evil which you must do regardless, and you must do to get out. Our claim then from closing opposition is that through investing in your own industries, in nationalization, you're able to have greater access to loans, which means you're able to get out of these crises. What do we want to start by framing? We think that it is often the case that countries can simply not spend their way out of crises for a couple of reasons. Firstly, they do not have the money. Your taxation is inefficient or corrupt. Natural resources are not there and you're not able to attract those to come into your country. You do not have the population in order to tax. Secondly, you're not able to get loans internationally or to get investments internationally because people do not want to go into that country because your industries are too weak to work. Therefore, you need investments and support. You need the IMF to come in. You need the World Bank to come in, as closing government speaks about themselves. We think that if we show that you get this, we show that you're able to get these countries out of these crises. Loans are not issued to countries without proper electricity, manufacturing, and existing industries within these countries. Without local strong industries. We note two mechanisms for this. The first is that they're not seen as likely to repay, which is to say, if you cannot run your own economy, if there is no capacity for you to make money into the future and to employ people, then there is no ability for you to pay back a World Bank loan. It means you're going to default, like many countries have, which received loans during orthodoxy back in the 90s, which has since ceased following the 2008 financial crisis. We would note that it is just not worthwhile to put into these countries, and note that countries within international institutions like the World Bank are also investors themselves in the same way as a private actor, and the US are not going to spend loads of money if they don't think that they're ever going to get that sort of investment back. The second thing to say is there's a simple substitution effect. The reason for this is because in crises, often a crisis in one country will affect many different countries. The reason why is because the global economy is just interconnected. Global supply chains are connected towards different countries so that you can access cheap labor, so that you can move your resources to places where they might be more beneficial to manufacture, stuff like this. As a result, many countries are suffering. Many countries will be looking for loans, which means that if one country is just showing that they're unable to be able to repay because they do not have the local sources, like if Djibouti shows that they do not have industries which work, then India will get that loan, which might be larger for them, but doesn't allow for like more diffuse benefits to more different countries, which can allow for more security in this time. Given this then, under proposition, we think that companies become far too powerful in a full free market. There are two broad reasons for this. The first is that they do not need to compete with national companies, actually the mechanization provided by closing government, which is to say that since, like in a place like Ireland, Vodafone as a large phone company would not, and a Wi-Fi company would not need to compete with Air, which would be a domestic industry, then that means that you're able to capture and squeeze a market writ large. You do not need to do things like lower your prices, you do not need to do things like offer better services, because you're not competing with these domestic industries. The second thing to say is preemptive lack of regulation, which is to say, when you believe that as a state, that companies are your key out of an economic crisis, as you will on Gov, then you do not want to scare them off and you do not want to harm them. You do not want to get rid of your safety net and you're, as such, reluctant to regulate against them to be quiet, open in government. As a result then, you do things like not enforcing your tax regulation properly because you're afraid that Apple are going to flee out of your country. The implication of this then is that these companies are not held to the highest account they could be. The risk here is that often during times of economic crisis, companies flee. They leave these countries and they do not stay as a safety net for you to be able to enforce into the future. There are two reasons for this. The first is that while often global, as I framed, crises can be global, they're worse in some countries than others due to things like exogenous factors. For instance, Italy was hit harder by COVID than New Zealand, and as a result, as a business, you'd want to be able to carry out business within New Zealand as opposed to remaining in Italy. So that's the incentive. If you have a more open market, one that's less affected by a crisis, it makes sense that you operate there. What's the capacity then, secondly, in order to be able to move to different countries and be able to operate? We would notice that it's becoming increasingly easy to move between countries for a couple of reasons. Working from home, which is to say that because of access to things like Zoom, the internet and stuff like this, businesses in the tertiary sector can have employees working in different countries and can quickly get rid of labor forces in some place and train up in other places, particularly where there are surpluses in the amount of, no thank you, skilled laborers coming out of places like colleges. We'd also note that due to increased just like cheapness of travel and being able to move your resources between countries, there are increasing subsidiaries and franchising within one country as opposed to the one that you've originally set up in just empirically. As a result, we argue that these companies can move, whereas the state obviously cannot move. A state industry cannot move outside of the state. That's the comparative here implicitly. The implication then is that these countries are simply unreliable. CG says FDI may not come in, and that's the big harm. We would note that FDI remains in these states and private companies remain in these states, broadly for three reasons. Firstly, they may need access to resources within these states that they might uniquely have. For example, states are not going to move out of a Qatar if they are seeming to invest more in their state-owned enterprises because they just need access to things like oil. Secondly, you build supply chains through countries which are relatively immobile, which means that you need to be, if one link breaks by moving out of it, then you're not able to have cheaper goods being produced at the back end. The third thing to say is that you often just want to access large markets like India and China. As a result, we think that FDI comes in, as well as, I'll take you in a second, the domestic industries. This means we flip the competition argument coming out of closing government because you have state-run enterprises competing with the private ones, which means that you get all the benefits they wanted to claim in that argument. Before we move on, go.
Your extension asserts the top-half clash as a premise. If the infrastructure you build sucks, you still don't incentivize loans and investments.
No, because we said that there's substantial capacity for you to invest well, particularly considering on your side the comparative is plausibly that you're not able to invest in the first place because there's no incentive for a company which is going to move out of your country to make sure that your roads and things like that are good. So the comparative here is better on opposition. But do countries invest in domestic industry? Here we're going to parallel mechanize the opening opposition. They give reasons which would imply that you want to invest in your local industries. Here are three different ones that access the same impact. Firstly, creating jobs creates votes, which is to say that if you give
money into domestic industries, then people who you hire are just more likely to support you. Secondly, control. You believe you will run these companies well and efficiently because they're underneath your branding. Thirdly, visibility and instrumentality. This plays on the opening government mechanism, which is the white elephant projects. If you build something like a train line or an electricity grid, this is something which is seen as visibly good and linked to your government. Given this, we show that you have an incentive uniquely on opposition to invest in these domestic industries. This means that in times where crises come in, you're able to get access to the loans that I framed at the top of the speech are very important. Note, on vulnerability, this affects the vast majority of countries in the world which are not wealthy enough to spend themselves out of these crises, which on the access of weighing of that vulnerability and the irreversibility of not being able to access other resources beats all of the three teams in this debate. For these reasons, opposing opposition.
We thank the speaker for that speech. We now invite the government whip to conclude the government bench.
First, I'm going to do closing opposition, then I'm going to talk about economic growth, and finally I'm going to talk about crises. Let's first talk about closing opposition. The first claim is that companies become far too powerful and you need state industries in order for them to have to compete with them. The first thing I just want to point out is the point of our case is that you obviously have to be competing with other companies. I just want to be clear about what Hayekian economics is, right? The point is that you are trying to encouraging free markets and you're having free market policies. That includes, for instance, things like having antitrust laws and having regulations that are making sure that free market can exist. That is the point, literally, of our policies. These are laws that ensuring free market, that ensuring having extra market entrance, then you have efficient competition between companies. The monopolization happens, obviously, on the closing opposition side because you have state subsidies, where, as per what we described, you are discouraging competition because you have companies that are being subsidized by the state, discouraging new entrants from coming in, meaning that all of those harms are obviously happening on closing up. The second thing is the bizarre thing about companies being unstable because they are fleeing. I think they themselves give a bunch of reasons about why that is something that is quite unlikely. One, because often you have a consumer base that exists that is stable within countries, meaning they are unlikely to be just fleeing randomly. But secondly, also they describe that you have physical resources that are existing within countries, again, and deeply unlikely scenario. I'm not sure really where the case was going. I think lots of it is just describing the stuff that we are benefiting from on our side. I want to talk about few clarifications dealing with some of the things from opening up. The stuff about collective action problem and roads. Let's just again be clear about what we have to defend. Building roads to exist at all is something that we still can do on our side. Hayekian economics is not full force anarcho-capitalism where the state doesn't exist and everything is done just literally by companies, right? When it comes to really necessary spending that it can't be overcome by market mechanisms, then we can do it without budget deficits because it obviously pays back for itself. Like think about, I don't know, fucking Margaret Thatcher, really in favor of our side. She was still building roads because, like, logic. Second, obviously, we agree with opening government that opening opposition is really running from their burden. When they are saying, actually, the Keynesian economics is really bad most of the time, which is why we only do it in the really small number of economic crisis instances. They say that it's about political accountability. Obviously, the problem is that even if they start doing it during economic crisis in the first place, people get used to the kinds of things that they are providing them, right? Think about, for example, Argentina. You had decades and decades of insane crises while Argentina was still spending huge amounts of money of massive electricity subsidies on massive amounts of welfare, because once you start doing it, it's very difficult to take it back. So even if they started during economic crisis, it's something that they need to be maintaining long term with all the harms that are coming from it. So opening opposition didn't really prove that they are supporting it over time. They are supporting putting it in very minimal number of instances, not explaining how they're actually able to reverse it. Let's then talk about why we're actually getting economic growth, the question that should be answered within the debate. Chris makes a fair point about opening government, which is that HUJI doesn't really show why companies can be doing good things while the government is also doing stimulus policies. And this is kind of true, because I think that HUJI does a really good job explaining that there is some inefficient allocation, but it does not explain why it actually leads to substantial harms to economic growth. Like, they point out that we are taking debt, but if you read the info slide, it kind of suggests one of the policies is that you're going to be running budget deficits. The fact that you're taking debt is kind of something that they need to be standing for regardless. So the problem with HUJI is, while we are possibly borrowing some of the analysis they are giving, they're not giving you quantifiable harms. So it's quite unclear from opening government what you can actually weigh, and it makes it hard to weigh against the benefits that Obench is able to show. For example, like tangible benefits like, well, we give people welfare and then they can eat food. So it's without actually explaining how it harms economic growth, what is the margin of it, and what the inefficient allocation actually causes, it's difficult to credit opening government against the optimism. What did we then describe in Wajeeh's speech? We explained that state subsidies are discouraging investment and are discouraging competition. The reason we described is that state-favored companies and the picking and choosing that HUJI points to obviously leads to less confidence for both foreign investment coming to your country, but also for new market entrants to want to set up a company that is actually able to compete. Because you, one, are having a difficulty competing with someone who is being subsidized by the state, but also it's incredibly unpredictable, given that you can't rely on market mechanisms, but you need to rely on whims of the government. Even if they are choosing decently well, you can't be relying on how they're going to be choosing, so it's very difficult for anyone to plan. Before I talk about it, yes?
A free market is not a fair market. Anti-competitive practices abound when the state is hesitant to intervene. Market accountability fails when monopolies have no fair competition and waste money.
I think I already covered that when I was responding to closing up, right? Like, the point of the policies that we are describing is that you are doing interventions specifically to prevent that. So you're doing things like having antitrust laws. You're intervening into ensuring free market to break up monopolies and things like that. That's our side. On their side, they are giving companies money, creating more monopolies. I think they need to stop running from and stop crossing the house. What then this means? You mean that you have far less competition. That is that you have less pressure to be actually putting prices down. So even if they are subsidizing some companies, you never have the pressure for becoming more efficient, for lowering prices between each other. You have less employment and jobs that get created naturally by just having more competition. This weighs over the welfare benefits from opening up, because it's obviously preferable to be able to get out of the state when you need to be relying on welfare at all, and we are the ones who are ensuring it by the fact that we are both lowering the cost of living and ensuring that people have access to employment. Finally, let's then talk about crisis. O describes that stimulus can sometimes help in time of crisis. We pointed out they have a problem, which is that they are solving a problem that they are themselves causing. Hadar realizes that this might be relevant at minute 6. We actually explain concrete reasons about why they are creating crisis much more on their side of the house. The fact that you have companies much more dependent on subsidies, the fact that you have issues with things like currency manipulation that makes you much more susceptible to intervention into your currency, causing much more instability within that, or the fact that you have liquidity issues. The reason that this weighs over opening opposition is that, again, it's obviously far more preferable to have less crises than just having a potential mechanism to be dealing with them, because the consequences of crisis, even if they are possibly able to address them, are regardless quite bad, and we prefer to have less of them. For all those reasons, proud to propose.
We thank the speaker for that speech. We now invite the opposition whip to conclude this debate as a whole. Yeah, guys.
I think it is unfortunate that
the rest of the debate chooses to engage in jargon and mechs rather than engaging in what the real impact of any of this is on real people who live in any of these countries. Like, finance is not just a thing that happens in the abstract that economists talk about. It's a thing that affects real people's lives in tangible ways. I think then for government to entirely sidestep crises or pretend that they do not matter, when the MG themselves concede that the crisis happen for many uncontrollable reasons, is just avoiding their burden and avoiding the genuine and real impacts of this debate. Let's first engage with the glib government response to our case. The first is to say, we can have on our side antitrust laws, the free market can exist. The first thing I would say, panel, is that sounds significantly like government intervention. And I think in particular, you cannot just assert that Hayekian economic policy means that you're willing to intervene in cases to protect the free market if you look at all of the examples and definitions in the info slide, being that you do not intervene and you allow the free market to take place unchecked. You allow the free hand of that market to play out without government interference. I think it is a nice thing to assert, a convenient thing for opposing government to assert, that you would just interfere in the cases that is convenient for them. But for them to accuse opposition bench of crossing the House, when they themselves are crossing the House and Gov bench, I actually think it's incredibly hypocritical. But the second thing in response to thank you later on is to say companies won't flee in crises. Firstly, if they have a consumer base, and secondly, if they have physical resources. The first thing I would say is, obviously, as is empirically true, they can at least downsize. And given the profit incentive that corporations have, which is to retain as much profit as possible, if it is no longer profitable when people are not spending in recessions to have as many staff as possible, naturally, they will fire people. And that means that minimum, you have people massively losing their jobs in these times, which I think is bad. Like, it is bad when in an economic crisis people do not have money. They do not have the ability to know if they're going to pay their rent. They do not know if they're going to be able to put food on the table. They do not know what their economic future looks like. And at least on our side, government intervention means you create jobs, or you put money in people's hands, which gives them the certainty to know that they can pay their rent, or they can buy their groceries, which actually is an immense comfort to people, apart from meeting their physical needs. But the second thing I would say is, no, thank you. Obviously, your consumer base is no longer as valuable if they do not have money to spend in recessions. Obviously, your physical resources are no longer as valuable to the government if you no longer have people to sell them to, or the likelihood you have a market if you do not trust that government is likely to recover from the crisis that they are currently in. All of which means no thank you. But the benefits that Lucie points out might mean companies don't flee are both unable to respond to the many cases in which companies do, but also unable to engage the fact that at least it becomes much less valuable to have those things if you are unsure if that country's going to get out of the crisis. Anyway, no thank you. First thing I want to say then is just there are a sizable number of crises that obviously cannot be prevented. I think that government need to engage with this property in order to win this debate. Firstly, as Wajeeh says in MG, sudden shocks like COVID shut down the economy in ways that you cannot predict. And this happens across the world. Anytime that there is a massive black swan event that affects people's lives, anytime there's something that causes people to not be able to spend anymore, not be able to go out anymore. But these things often do, absent interference from the government, lead to certain industries shutting down in ways that we think are bad. Like, think about in COVID, if the government hadn't interfered to preserve the airline industries would have no longer existed, because per government bench's frame of economic policy, you'd have let those people not have jobs anymore, retrain into new jobs, and then after COVID, they would have been retrained into new jobs, and the airline industry would no longer exist. That's an important industry that then would have taken probably a decade to recover, and these things mean that even if you recover from those crises, they're irredeemable and irrecoverable impacts that do not get solved without government interference. But secondly, as Anna says, no thank you, the interconnectedness of the global economy means the crisis often spread, regardless of how good on government bench your individual policy is. So in 1994, when the tequila crisis takes place in Mexico, you also have economic crisis spreading to Argentina and the rest of Latin America. In 2008, when you have the US financial crisis, it affects the global economy also. And this means that it actually doesn't matter if government believe that the policies they're standing for prevent economic crises, because it fails to engage with either the black swan event the MG concedes exist, or the fact that, no thank you, other countries' crises are also likely to spread to you and have harms. Which means you ought to be prepared for crises, but also you cannot sidestep crises just on the basis of believing Hayekian economic policies are able to prevent them. This fails to engage with the fact that exogenous shocks exist and certainly and often cause crises. But the second thing I would note that I think is just genuinely relevant and critical is that people's lives during crises is just clearly the most important impact of this debate, and the most realistic one that defends whether or not people survive that crisis and what their lives look like during and afterwards. The first thing I would say that happens on our side is state-owned and state-subsidized industries remain, regardless of crises taking place. Opening government call these vanity projects. They call them unimportant and inefficient industries. But panel, I'm not actually sure why an inefficient train, no thank you, is a bad one, is a bad one, right? There's still people who ride that train who require it to get from home to work, from the city they live in to the place that they work. or to visit family. And I'm really sure maybe the private market would never have created that train, but it obviously still has massive value to people. And given this impacts things more than just the transport industry, people's access to hospitals or any other industry the state would either own or subsidise, there's just obviously certain services which benefit people's lives and are able to be sustained through crises because those services will not leave in the same way the private ones do. And he says this, no response from Goldberg. But secondly, I think jobs just don't massively disappear during crises because corporations either downsize or flee. Keynesian economic stimulation means you either create jobs during these times or you put money in people's hands during these times. Either way, stimulating spending which helps people spend their way out of crisis in this way. But that is the only way that you make sure people actually have the money to pay their rent or have the money to pay for their groceries in those times. I think that's incredibly important, both in and of itself, but also for getting out of crises. But
Last
before I
chance.
move on, I will take the OGP on.
Private firms don't need accountability. They follow demand and so supply where there is need for selfish profit incentives. That's why trains are fully privatized in Japan and work great.
Demand disappears during crises. That means those companies flee. And then they don't return, and the services they provide are not available to people. But the third thing I would say is that in and of itself, confidence in the government's ability to get out of crises happens only when there are services that stay and you don't see mass capital flight of various different corporations. I'm not thirsty for people. That's incredibly important comfort to believe that your country is able to recover and your government is likely to recover because they're literally taking actions and policies to help protect you. Secondly, it means companies perceive it as likely, where private companies exist, that you will recover, so are less likely to flee on our side because there's active action being taken and it's making an impact on the economy. But thirdly, and Andy says explicitly, you have access to capital in terms of loans to spend your way out when organizations like the IMF believe that you are likely to be able to repay that loan in the first instance. So all of this means the ability to spend your way out of crisis is dependent on the willingness to interfere, but also the capacity for everyone to act like you're able to spend your way out of crisis and therefore behave in the way that it happens is also contingent on that. The weighing on why this matters so much is firstly, given what we've explained, it is certain that crises happen beyond the LO assertions because of exogenous shocks. Secondly, because crises are cyclical if you do not solve them. And thirdly, because even if the market solves in Gov bench, I just think in the meantime people starve and we don't like that.
We thank the speaker for the speech. Indeed, all speakers for fine debate. Across the floor, shake hands, leave permanently, and best of luck for the break. Panel, let's take 3